Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and thank you to everyone at the Secretariat staff. I'd like to welcome everyone to our 97th IPHC interim meeting. I think hopefully this is, as it has been in the past, a good opportunity for the public and for us as commissioners to hear from the Secretariat staff on the most recent stock assessment information, get a better understanding of the issues that are likely to face us when we reach our annual meeting early next year. I would like to extend my appreciation to everyone who's been able to prepare the documents that we're receiving here today. And I don't have any formal additional comments. Paul, I'll turn it over to you to see if you have anything that you would like to add.
Have anything else to add? Look forward to getting the update and getting a better appreciation of where the halibut stock currently resides. So I'm ready. I think we're ready to go, Glenn.
Okay, great. So without any further ado, I see that we have the agenda before us, and I'll ask if there are any changes or concerns about the agenda that we should address now. Not seeing any, I would propose that we adopt the agenda. And not seeing any objections. So with that, Dr. Wilson, I believe I will turn it over to you with the agenda as adopted.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we have agenda item 3, which is all about the IPHC process. It contains 5 specific items, which are general updates on progress that we've made over the course of 2021. So if I could have the first 3.1, which is paper 3, which is an update on the actions arising from the 97th session of the annual meeting and the special sessions that were held throughout 2021. And just a reminder that your viewing window, you can maximize or zoom into any particular slide or document, so it certainly makes it easier for you to review. So paper 3 is the standard update on actions arising. This version consists of 2 appendices. Appendix A, which is the update on the actions arising from the 97th session of the annual meeting, and Appendix B, as I indicated, includes updates on the decisions made at the 2 special sessions, the 10th and 11th special sessions of the IPHC held this year. Now, my intention is just to go through these briefly, update and request additional updates on any remaining items, noting that most of these, if there are directives for action on research or assessment or the MSc, you're going to be receiving detailed updates on those throughout the course of today and early tomorrow. From the IM097, there was only one recommendation, recommendation 01, that the Commission recommended that further consultation between the contracting parties and fisheries stakeholders be undertaken on the administrative and potential policy implications of a year-round fishery. The only update that we have at the moment is that it's our understanding is that that's potentially going to be deferred for another year, but I might pause at this moment just to see if there are any updates from either contracting party. So back to you, Chair.
Why don't I turn to you first to see if there are any updates or comments on this agenda item?
About whether there's any proposal or work required by the Secretariat?
Yes, that's correct, Chair. So the recommendation as adopted at the AM was for the contracting parties to lead those discussions with your fishery stakeholders. So at the moment, there's not any tasking for the Secretariat. It was agreed to leave that to the contracting parties to determine if you wanted to progress the year-round fishery season proposal or not. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thanks very much. I guess, Glenn, at this point in time, I don't have anything to add, but maybe we will before the end of this meeting. So maybe we could just make a note that we'll come back to this before this meeting concludes.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Paul. That's fine with me. So we'll just note that this agenda item remains open and that we can revisit that towards the end of the meeting. Thanks, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much. There were a number of requests arising from the annual meeting. Request number 1, which is currently in progress, was for a directive from the Commission for the Secretariat to coordinate with contracting parties to develop a potential MOU to promote data sharing among the Secretariat and contracting parties at no additional cost. This is something that's still in progress, and we're working with the contracting parties to determine what's necessary and what's not necessary. We do have on our website a list of all of the active MOUs and collaborative agreements that we have with both contracting parties, but also individual domestic agencies and academic institutions. At this point, we'll provide a bit of an update in the next agenda item, 3.2, on the current active collective agreements and MOUs in terms of the data that was collected and shared for this year. Request number 2 has been completed, and Dr. Hicks is going to provide an update in paper 13 later this morning or early tomorrow morning, depending on how we go through the agenda. Request 3 is an additional request from the Commission, which we're pending updates from both from the USA, and I understand that's potentially going to be spoken to later in the day when we hear from contracting parties verbally, but we don't have anything additional to add at this point. Request 04 and 5 have both been completed. One was to send out the survey and the media release, which occurred on the 16th of February, and the other was to adopt the financial regulations and publish them, which were published in the 29th of February. Request 6, which is to do with the intersessional review and of the financial regulations and to make further improvements and movement towards GAP standards. That's in progress and will be provided to the Finance and Administration Committee in February next year. And so the deadline for that paper is the 24th of December, so you can expect that to be published 30 days prior. The Rules of Procedure update were again published on the 29th of February. In addition, Request 8, the Commission requested that the Secretariat undertake an intersessional review and recommend further improvements to the IPHC Rules of Procedure. This was particularly noted for the Conference Board, noting that the Conference Board made a number of recommendations for improvements to the Rules of Procedure earlier this year. The Processor Advisory Board, noting the conflicting text in the rules, and in addition, the Research Advisory Board, which met yesterday and has also made some additional recommendations for edits to their terms of reference. And so that will be provided by the 25th of December, 30 days prior to the annual meeting itself. Request 9 was completed, and then we move into the special sessions. So Appendix B, there was one request arising from the 10th special session, and again, that was related to fishery regulations, which were adopted and published on the 22nd of February. Then there were 2 recommendations and adoptions arising from the 11th special session. The first related to the management strategy evaluation work and that of the MSAB. As indicated, Dr. Hicks is going to provide you with a full update on the work that's been undertaken in association with paper 13. And then finally, the Commission also adopted the budget at the 11th special session, and I'm pleased to advise that the contracting party contributions for this next fiscal year have been received in full. So that certainly alleviated those fiscal concerns and cash flow issues that we've previously highlighted. And so, Chair, that's all I have for paper 03 as updates, and I'm happy to take any questions before moving to the next paper.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Why don't I turn to you, Commissioner Rael, to see if you have any additional comments or questions. And I'm not seeing any additional hands, so I believe we can go ahead and proceed to the next agenda item. Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. So if we could have paper 4 brought up, please. So paper 4 is the preliminary or interim draft report of the Secretariat for 2021. I'm going to skim through this relatively quickly as we still have a couple of months to be summarized into the final version that will be presented at the annual meeting. However, I did want to highlight a couple of key components, and the first being in section 3, which is related to our interns that we brought to the Secretariat this year. And to run us through the work undertaken by the 2 interns, I'll pass to Dr. Planis briefly. So over to you, Dr. Planis.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Yes, this year we had 2 highly successful IPHC interns. One was Ms. Maya Stock, an undergrad from Oregon State University, and the second one was Ms. Eva Subkvan DeVita, also an undergraduate in marine biology at Western Washington University. They both worked in the IPHC Biological Laboratory between June and August of this year. They worked extremely well with staff, and they participated mainly in 2 projects. One, they actively participated in the 2020 genotyping of commercial samples, results that you will hear in a little bit from Dr. Stewart. And also they participated in other research projects such as the recreational discard mortality rate study that we're conducting. So this was a really highly successful internship period for us this year. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Planis. The next section I wanted to highlight was the Merit Scholarship, and we are due for the scholarship panel to meet again in 2022 to consider applications for the next Merit Scholarship. We did have our current recipients defer for a short period throughout 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so some of the expenses that were going to be incurred in 2022 and 23 will be moved by approximately 1 year. But that won't interfere with the 2-year recruitment cycle that we have for the Merit Scholarship. The meetings throughout 2021 have all occurred electronically, and the very last agenda item, or second last agenda item for this meeting, the Commission has requested that we'll discuss in detail the potential for a physical or hybrid meeting of the annual meeting in late January 2022. So I'll just flag that now that we have that request, and we'll discuss that among commissioners, but also to gain stakeholder feedback. The next component of the report that I will highlight is section 7, which talks specifically about the interactions with contracting parties. I'm highlighting here a couple of the MOUs or collective agreements that we undertake with contracting party agencies. The first being in section 7.2.1, which is the MOU and collective agreement regarding rockfish between PHMA and the IPHC and DFO. This has been deferred for 2021 due to insufficient funds from PHMA. And we are currently in discussions with DFO about how we can look forward for a potential collaborative agreement of some description in 2022 and moving forward. The current indication is that there may not be a need from DFO, and we will just be working with DFO and PHMA over the next short period to determine whether that sampling is going to occur dockside versus on our fishery independent setline survey. So we'll have some more updates on that very shortly, I'm sure. Section 7.3 to do with US collaborative agreements and port sampling grants. We have the Alaska Port Sampling Grant, which has been going for quite a number of years now. The current 5-year grant will expire at the end of 2023, and we have commenced discussions with NOAA to determine how best to extend that agreement through the grant system or some other format. In addition, we collect Pacific cod and spiny dogfish for NOAA through the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. I'm pleased to advise that sampling was completed successfully with all of the data provided to the necessary individuals from NOAA. Similarly, we have a MOU with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is an ongoing long-term MOU. It was renewed a year or so ago, and again, that information collected on approximately 8 Fishery Independent Setline Survey stations has been provided to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. As an update for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, specifically on abundance-based management of Pacific halibut, I might pass to Dr. Hicks to speak briefly about our engagement with the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council and in particular the ABM working group. So I'll pass to Dr. Hicks at this point.
Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Good morning, Commissioners. Brief update on abundance-based management, or ABM, as you may be aware. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council has been investigating moving from fixed prohibited species catch limits, which is also called PSC limits, to an abundance-based PSC limit type program. And right now they have 3 alternatives on the table, or that they'll be considering at the December council meeting, which begins on Thursday. We've been investigating this for a number of years. IPHC has been engaged with the working group and helping where they can. The alternatives for consideration consist of lookup tables, 3 alternative lookup tables, which depend on 2 different indices. And that's an index from the FIS, or the IPHC Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And that's an index developed over Region 4 and 4B. And also it includes an index for the Eastern Bering Sea Trawl Survey. So using the combination of those 2 indices, you can find in a lookup table, find the appropriate cell and apply the PSC, or find the PSC limit from that cell. And so these different lookup tables just are different values within them, and they classify the 2 surveys based on either low, medium, or high for the setline survey, and then the trawl survey as a low or a high option. So there's also a couple of options that are available to tack on to these alternatives. There are options such as using a 3-year rolling average of those survey index to reduce variability potentially. There's an option to how it will be applied in the first year of implementation, whether or not that'll vary by some amount, greater or less than the current PSC limit. And it also an option for an incentive on the fleets to maintain the actual mortality on halibut below that PSC limit. So you will find in info document 5 a description of the IPHC Fishery Independent Setline Survey Index that we've developed for ABM. It provides the update of that index, including the 2021 value. And it also provides a description of the units on that index and some other alternative versions of that index that might be more intuitive to certain people that want to understand it. You might find on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council website under agenda item C2, there are many documents there, including the draft environmental impact statement, which was recently reviewed or sent out for public comment. At the December council meeting, the council will be considering all of those comments, and I believe there's a summary document of the comments from that review. And they will be deliberating and hopefully taking final action on this item. You will notice on the agenda there's a lot of time available for the ABM topic at the December meeting. And we will be contributing or paying attention however we can, and be able to provide a summary at the annual meeting in January. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hicks. The next update is to do with the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and specifically regarding the potential, or the upcoming rather, handover of management of the 2A fishery. The council has provided some specific wording here, and I would just take you to, the screen stops jumping, the status of implementation, which is on the bottom of the screen at the moment. And NIMS has indicated that they're anticipating a schedule that will conclude with NOAA, NIMS taking management of the non-Indian directed commercial fishery beginning in 2023. Now, there's quite a bit of collaborative work that will need to be undertaken throughout the course of the coming year, 2022, including handing over of a range of processes and information that we currently have in terms of how to manage, how we are currently managing the fishery. But we're certainly very much looking forward to that expected full handover beginning in 2023. The only other update that I have is generally in terms of our communications and outreach. Obviously, our physical communication and outreach has been reduced for the last 2 years due to the ongoing pandemic. But we certainly maintain constant connections with stakeholders, whether it be through our website, our reporting, the IPHC circulars and media releases, and also our general external engagement. And in the report, we outline a range of external committees and organisation appointments which staff within the Secretariat hold. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but it does give you an indication that we are maintaining our engagement across the board in the various activities that we have in past years. In addition, the number of publications of peer-reviewed journal articles has continued to increase. And in 2021, I think we're up to 7 specifically already published journal articles, another one in press, and a further in review. And so that work will continue. One of the upsides, I guess, of the past year or so is that has meant that staff have had more time to dig through old data sets or spend additional time analyzing the data that has already been collected for publication. And certainly congratulations to all of the staff who have managed to publish that work in a timely manner throughout 2021. And so, Chair, with that, that's all I have for the report of the Secretariat as a general update. As I indicated at the start, we'll be updating this paper and publishing by the 25th of December on the full activities of the Secretariat throughout 2021 that are not included in papers already before the Commission. So thank you, Chair. That's correct, Chair. Chair, so I could have paper 05 brought up, please. So this will be a very brief presentation. This is the standing paper we provide on the implementation of the recommendations from the second performance review that was completed a number of years ago. Contained within Appendix A is the full table of recommendations that arose from that second performance review. It incorporates priorities and responsibilities and timelines if they've been applied, and then also a general update on the status of that implementation. We have made throughout 2021 incremental progress on most of these recommendations, not all, and that is indicated in this update or status column on the right. The intention is to undertake further review and update of this document prior to the annual meeting, where it will be presented in a little more detail. So at this point, I wasn't going to step through the many recommendations and the specific updates, but simply note that it's there for information, and then to potentially take any questions on specific recommendations that have arisen from the performance review. And so I'll pause there, Chair, and pass back to you. Thanks, Chair. I think Commissioner de Grief has a hand raised there. It might be a bit hard to see.
Thank you, Chair. I was just reviewing request number 9, and the Commission recommended that the IPHC Secretariat, in consultation with the Commission, develop minimum data collection standards. I see pending, but I see nothing else. Has there been any progress made on this, which it looked like it was defined as a kind of a high priority?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner de Grief. No, at this point, we have not made any progress with this specific recommendation. It's the intention that this would be targeted in 2022. But at the moment, we simply haven't had the resources to dedicate to this specific recommendation. That said, we do expect that it will probably only take a year for us to undertake that full review, which would still leave us 2 years to provide that back to the contracting parties and the Commission for consideration and potential adoption domestically. So at this point, no progress, but we do expect to be completed by 2024, which is the current timeline. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Commissioner de Grief. Yes, thanks, Chair. Yes, so the process we went through was once these recommendations were adopted by the Performance Review Panel, they were then presented to the Commission for consideration. In doing so, the Commission I had assigned a priority ranking, whether it be high, medium, low, specifically highlighting who would complete the task and this timeline that's indicated where it's appropriate. And for some of the recommendations, such as recommendation 09 that we've just spoken to, the Commission specifically did not agree to the recommendation arising from the Performance Review Panel. And so you can see at the first paragraph within recommendation 09, it highlights that the Performance Review Panel 02 recommended a specific action, but then below that, the Commission decided it did not want the Secretariat to proceed with the performance review recommendation and developed the subsequent recommendation there, which Commissioner de Grief just highlighted. So in short, yes, the Commission has reviewed and assigned and given priority rankings to each of the recommendations from the Performance Review Panel. That said, of course, every meeting of the Commission or intersessionally, the Commission can redirect the Secretariat at any time, obviously. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Chair. So in those cases where it's specifically tasked to the contracting parties, it's something that was discussed and intended to receive updates during the annual reports from each of the contracting parties. So in this case, for example, for the upcoming annual meeting, there was the expectation that the contracting parties would give an indication of the progress or otherwise that's being made. And so in those cases, there's no specific tasking unless the wording specifically says so, such as in recommendation 09, for the Secretariat to undertake any particular work. And so, for example, in recommendation 13 and 14, which are assigned to the contracting parties, the Secretariat's role is simply to provide reminders of those performance review recommendations, and then it sits in the hands of the contracting parties to determine how to undertake that work or otherwise. Thank you, Chair. Great, thank you very much, Chair. So moving on to agenda item 3.4. This is the, and if we could have the Secretariat bring up the report of the RAB, the 22nd session of the Research Advisory Board, which was held yesterday, please. So I'm pleased to advise that the Research Advisory Board did meet yesterday. There were, if I could just have the Secretariat zoom in for me there. My eyes are failing me. So the Research Advisory Board met yesterday, again, virtually, and developed a number of actions for the Secretariat, and then also just more broadly. If we could just have the page width set, that might help. While that's been set up, there were two requests that arose from the Research Advisory Board meeting of yesterday. The first request regarding the Fishery Independence Setline Survey. There was quite a detailed discussion around the 2021 Fishery Independence Setline Survey, and the RAB noted with appreciation the enhanced communication and consultation undertaken for the 2021 Fishery Independent Setline Survey, and requested that this heightened level of communication continue moving forward. And so certainly a lot of positive feedback about the survey this year, and additional request was also made regarding the design for 2022, which I'll just move on to in a moment. In addition, the RAB requested further review of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey whale depredation effectiveness criteria, which in some instances may either be too liberal or too conservative. And in particular, there was discussion around orca depredation, and noting that at the moment there's no quantitative visual assessment criteria. There was a request for that to be developed and potentially implemented. In addition, the RAB provided the following two endorsements. First of all, the RAB endorsed some additional improvements to Appendix 7 of the IPHC Rules of Procedure specific for the Research Advisory Board, and those are provided in paragraph 4, and you can click the link in the report to see what those are. And then finally, regarding key ongoing research activities, again, the RAB noted the 5-year biological and ecosystem science research program that's being undertaken and nearing its initial completion, and has endorsed the general approach taken from its perspective, noting its terms of reference. And so, Chair, I will pause there. That's the key outcomes from the meeting of yesterday, and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I have one question, which is the
Yeah, thank you for the question, Chair. In this case, they are relatively minor in terms of trying to address some of the concerns that were raised about the overlap in the apparent mandate of both the Scientific Review Board and the Research Advisory Board. Those edits will be and have been incorporated into the interim meeting document on the rules of procedure and will again be provided for consideration at the annual meeting before potential adoption. And so if I was to scroll down, you can see in this particular case the amendments simply to the terms of reference component of the rules of procedure for the RAB. Again, simply highlighting the RAB's role about considering or suggesting research topics for incorporation into the ongoing 5-year research plan, removal of the review of research proposals, which is something the Scientific Review Board undertakes each year, and then again, simply ensuring that the role of the RAB and the Scientific Review Board are separate, noting that the RAB also provides us recommendations to the SRB concerning options for new research topics and also the prioritization. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Appreciate the brief update. Not seeing other hands from other commissioners, I believe we can proceed.
Thank you, Chair. So if we could have the SRB report 19 brought up on the screen, and I'm just checking to see if the chair is available. Is Secretary could just check if Sean, I'm not seeing him on the meeting list. So the chair was going to present the key outcomes of the Scientific Review Board. And so what we might do is I'll reach out to see if he is able to come back on later in the meeting and present anything in more detail. But just to keep the process running then, the Scientific Review Board met twice in 2021, both virtually, the 18th session and the 19th session. The first meeting of the Scientific Review Board is aimed at, for want of a better description, recalibrating some of the work or the research efforts that the Secretariat is undertaking. And so as such, there are no specific recommendations, but only requests for redirection or additional analyses for the Secretariat to undertake throughout the course of 2021, leading up to the second Scientific Review Board, so in this case, the 19th session. There were a number of recommendations arising from this second Scientific Review Board meeting held in 2021, and the key ones have been highlighted in the executive summary, starting on page 5 of the report itself. Each of these recommendations has been taken on board by the Secretariat, and for each of the subsequent presentations on the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, the stock assessment, the modeling of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey data, and also the management strategy evaluation work are going to be addressed during those presentations. And so rather than stepping through each of these specific recommendations, I would propose we simply leave it to the presenters to refer back to the SRB recommendations from arising in 2021. And then we'll also make contact with the chair to determine if he's available to answer any additional questions you might have directly for the Scientific Review Board. And so with that, Chair, I'll pass back to you. Thank you. Great, thank you very much, Chair. So the next agenda item is agenda item 4, which is the fishery data overview for 2021, and I'll pass to Ms. Erickson to run through the presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and thank you, Chair. Are you able to hear me all right? Okay. I will present, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, paper 6, agenda item 4, which is the fisheries data overview for 2021. So removals are from the IPHC convention waters. All values are in net weight, which is head off weight and as well as being eviscerated. All values represent projections for the full year. And the total Pacific halibut mortality for 2021 is 17,104 tons. Looking at removals by sectors, they're depicted here with the directed commercial fishery contributing to 66% of the total removals and the greatest share, followed by the recreational fishery at 20%, the non-directed commercial fishery at 9%, and subsistence and the fishery independent set line survey at 3% and 2%. So when comparing 2021 removals to removals for 2020, last year, the greatest differences are represented by recreational fishery removals, which moved from 16% of the overall to 20%, and by non-directed commercial discard mortality removals, which shifted from 13% of the overall to 9%. And looking more closely at the 2021 total mortality by contracting party, the total mortality from the waters of Canada is 3,018 tons and 5% under the mortality limit. The total mortality from the waters of the United States of America is 13,659 tons and 6% under the mortality limit. So a closer view, or a closer review rather, of directed commercial fishery removals by contracting party. In Canada, the directed commercial fishery opened on March 6th and remains open until December 7th. Landings are projected to be 2,191 tons, or 4% under the fishery limit. For the United States of America, off the West Coast, within the Treaty Indian directed commercial fishery, landings totaled 220 tons, or 2% under the fishery limit. The directed commercial fishery resulted in landings of 110 tons and 5% under the fishery limit. Landings within the salmon troll fishery are projected to be 8 tons and to be 59% under the fishery limit. And landings within the sablefish fishery are projected to be 29 tons and 9% under the fishery limit. In the United States of America, the directed commercial fishery opened on the 6th of March and remains open until the 7th of December. In Alaska, within the quota share fishery, 8,184 tons were landed and, or projected rather to be landed, and 8% under the fishery limit. And also within the Annette Island Reserve fishery, 12 tons were landed over 14 two-day openings. So just keeping in mind that the following graphs over the next 3 slides are available at the IPHC website, and they represent landings through the 15th of November. The first pair here that you see on this slide represent the coastwide landings for 2021 and the previous 3 years, and shows that landings in 2021 trended closer to the pre-pandemic landings of 2018 and 2019 than those in 2020. And looking at landings by contracting party, on this slide, the landings in Canada during 2021 trended very closely to landings for the previous 3 years. There does, on the graphs here for the 2021 values, there appears to be a slight drop at the end. However, this represents a slight lag in reporting, which is corrected as we move to later in the year. And landings in the United States of America and Alaska during 2021 trended closely with 2020 removals by the percentage of fishery limit, with weight trending more closely to previous years. So reviewing Pacific halibut mortality more closely, and in regards to any amounts in excess of fishery limits, no removals in Canada were found to be in excess of fishery limits. And then removals in the United States of America were projected to be in excess of fishery limits in two IPHC regulatory areas and in 2 fisheries. So the directed commercial discard mortality was in excess in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A by 93% and 61% respectively. And the recreational fishery removals projected for the guided fishery were in excess in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A by 42% and 26%. And the mortality estimates with the greatest uncertainty are the following. Within the directed commercial fishery for the United States of America, in Alaska, there is no observer coverage for vessels less than 40 feet in length. Within the recreational fishery for both Canada and the United States of America, the self-reporting of lodges. Within the subsistence fishery for Canada, recognizing the estimates have not been updated since 2007. And within the non-directed commercial fishery, the lower level of monitoring in some fisheries in the United States of America and the lack of fork length measurements in Canada since the pandemic. And with that, Chair, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so in this slide, I think I'm reading it correctly. Region 2-3 went over their allocation by roughly 9%. Is that correct? And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but was that driven mostly by sports fishery, rebounding from COVID, or what drove that? Sorry.
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner DeGreef, that is correct. For IPHC regulatory area 2C, the percentage is 109.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yes, again, through the chair, Commissioner DeGreef, I would say that that is correct. As the final slide showed, the main areas that drove that were the 2 limits that were exceeded there, which was both the
in
directed commercial
2021
discard
relative to
mortality as
2020,
well as
and
the
I think all of us have
guided
noticed some
recreational
substantive
fishery.
challenges in trying to
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Erickson. On the commercial discard mortality of 193%, what drove that?
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner
Is
Yamada.
this unusual or
That's the discard mortality, or what we previously referred to as
you're surprised
wastage.
at
So
these
it's
high percentages?
any discards that are
Was
in
there something special
excess
this year?
of the IFQ, allowed IFQ amount, or any mortality that occurs due to the undersized fish that are discarded. And then also any lost gear. So that a lot of that comes directly from the logs themselves.
So this is just an excess of our projection then?
No, it's not unusual for it to fluctuate like that. Yeah, there's,
All right, thank you.
I'd say there's a certain level of uncertainty, but that's not unusual for it to have, or to see those levels at times. It is a limit, but it is part of the overall directed commercial limit.
Yeah, I don't know if this is for Lara or possibly you could answer this, but I'm curious, do you have an overage provisions within your recreational guided fleet as we do in Canada? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair. We can move on then to agenda item 5, which consists of the stock status of Pacific halibut, the harvest decision table, and all of the analyses that are associated with it. And the first component of 5 is 5.1, which is the Fishery Independent Setline Survey design and implementation in 2021. And Ms. Kayla Uwalesi will present that. So over to you, Kayla.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Let's see here. I will be presenting IPHC Fishery Independent Setline Survey Design and Implementation in 2021. I initially would like to introduce the FIS team, myself, Kayla Uwalesi, the Setline Survey Coordinator, and then we have Colin Jones, Rachel Rillera, and Tyler Jack McCullough. Colin will be the permitting and data lead. Rachel is our fish sales lead, and Tyler is our gear lead. Well, Rachel and Tyler will both be handling bait as well this year. And as always, the entire team is always available for any questions. The primary objective of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is standardized fishery independent data collection for the Pacific halibut stock assessment and stock distribution estimation, looking at Pacific halibut distribution and abundance trends, and the collection of biological data. Both the gear and bait on the FIS is standardized. We used fixed gear with each skate measuring 548.6 meters or 1,800 feet, with 100 hooks spaced 5.5 meters or 18 feet apart. Number 3 circle hooks are threaded through the front on 61 to 122 centimeter or 24 to 48 inch ganyons, and 3 to 5 kilogram or 7 to 10 pound weights on each non-anchored skate end are placed. Our bait, as I have stated, is also standardized. We use frozen chum salmon at a number 2 semi-bright grade or better. This bait is cut 1/10 to 1/6 kilogram or 1/4 to 1/3 of a pound. And captains sign off on the bait quality and work with the IPHC Secretariat on board to ensure all bait is of the standard quality. This map shows the 2021 Fishery Independent Setline Survey. This year, the survey ran from May 28th to the 14th of September. In comparison to 2020, the survey ran the 26th of June through the 9th of September, noting that there was a late start due to COVID-19. And in 2019, the survey ran from May 26th to the 22nd of September. In 2021, 13 vessels participated in the FIS in comparison to 11 vessels in 2020 and 18 vessels in 2019, and 1,346 stations made up the 2021 design in comparison to 951 in 2020 and 1,531 in 2019. I do want to note as I move forward in the presentation that 87% of the stations were completed in 2021. That's 1,167 stations in total. In addition, there was a gear comparison that took place in 2021 comparing fixed gear to snap gear, and this took place in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A in the Seward Charter Region. Each station was fished twice in random order, once with fixed gear and once with snap gear. This map here shows the fixed gear stations with early stations and late stations displayed here. In 2021, the snap vessel completed all of their early stations first, which for this map, all of the fixed late stations would be the snap vessel's early stations and then vice versa. And the fixed gear vessel then proceeded to complete all stations in Seward, followed by the snap gear vessel coming in and completing their late stations. This shows all ineffective stations and sightings in 2021. We had one station in Area 2A with pinniped depredation, and 3 stations in 3B with shark depredation. In regulatory area 2B, there was 1 sperm whale depredation ineffective station, 4 in 2C, and 23 in 3A, and 3 in 3B, for a total of 31 stations coastwide with sperm whale depredation. And coastwide, we had 12 stations that were deemed ineffective due to orca depredation. And we had 1 station that was moved more than 3 nautical miles in regulatory area 2B, which was deemed ineffective. And there were gear issues in 6 stations and 3 stations with soak time that exceeded 24 hours, making them ineffective. And then also 2 stations with sand fleas in area 3A, totaling 59 ineffective stations for the 2021 FIS. The secondary objective of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is long-term revenue neutrality. And we achieved this through improved fish sale process with requests for tenders for each sale. And all bids are rated against specified criteria, and there are established controls for the review and approval for each sale, and all fish sale buyers are invoiced. We also have improved charter agreements through requests for tenders, and all submissions are rated against the same specified criteria as listed in the tender specifications. Additionally, we have began to sell the sampled U32 Pacific halibut over the past few years, noting that the price of U32 Pacific halibut is slightly less. Currently, the price difference coastwide for 2021 was approximately 82% of the average O32 price, with regulatory area 2A noting a 40% difference in price, whereas on the other extreme of regulatory area 2C only seeing a 4% difference in price. Tertiary objectives are collaboration with external parties. In 2021, we had a collaborative agreement with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, working on rockfish data collection. We conducted additional work on 8 rockfish index stations off the coast of Washington, where we did 100% hook sampling and collected rockfish data in collaboration with WDFW. We also have a collaborative agreement in Alaska with NOAA collecting sex length data on Pacific cod and spiny dogfish. And we are working with additional parties on agreements being discussed for 2022 and the future. Here are a few links directing you to the IPHC website to review the 2021 and past year FIS results. And this graph will show the predicted catch versus actual catch by IPHC regulatory area. Please note that this is for O32 catch, and this also only shows fixed gear. Therefore, the snap gear portion of the 2021 FIS is not included in this. I'd also like to note, as I previously mentioned, that out of the 1,346 stations, 1,167 stations were completed this year. We did have some charter areas that were left incomplete. Of note, the ADAC charter area, 36 out of 73 stations were completed, and area 4CDE, 75 out of 140 stations were completed due to fairly significant logistical, technological, mechanical issues with the vessels participating in those areas. And back to this graph here, please note that 75% of the predicted catch was caught, and in 2A, 109% was caught. And then there was a 94% of the predicted catch in 2B, 77% in regulatory area 2C, 67% in regulatory area 3A. We did see a good overage in regulatory area 3B at 121%, 4A at 63%, and 40% of the catch in 4B, again noting that 36 stations out of the 73 planned stations were completed in 4B, and then 48% of the actual catch compared to the predicted catch in regulatory areas 4, C, D, and E. Again, noting 75 stations out of the 140 were completed. And this table here will show the average price per pound in US dollars by IPHC regulatory area, noting that coastwide we saw an average price of $6.86. 2A had $5.18, and 2B we had $8.09, and then throughout Alaska we saw a range between the lower end of $5 up towards a higher, nearly just under $7 a pound. And then Pacific halibut sales in US dollars by IPHC regulatory area. This shows our total sales by regulatory area with a total coastwide amount of $5,646,747.85. I'd also like to note that in 2022, we will be releasing the tender specifications for the 2022 FIS. It is anticipated that these tender specifications will be published on our website in December. Our tender specifications will continue to be simplified with clear expectations regarding communication needs and other
Thank you, Ms.
aspects.
Willesi.
As we
Apologies if I
also
mispronounced your name.
initiated in
Let
2021,
me
the
turn to the
base
other
cost for
commissioners and see if there are
communications and
any
customs fees
questions.
are to be rolled into the lump sum, so we will be continuing that.
Commissioner DeGreef.
And the plan is to have tender bids due by the 31st of January. And with that, I will take any questions. Yes, thank you, Commissioner. The Seward charter area had 52 stations in 2021. In comparison, in 2020, we conducted the gear comparison in St. James, which I believe was 60 stations. And in 2019, we did conduct a larger gear comparison in regulatory area 2C. I don't know the station count offhand for that one, but I do recognize that it was slightly larger. Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I have heard some. There has been some comments, yes, from the vessels. They're obviously not as accustomed to processing these smaller Pacific halibut. Generally, I
Thank
tend
you,
not to
Commissioner
hear
DeGreef.
much
Commissioner
until
Morale.
they run into some sets where the U32 catch is a bit higher. But overall, the U32 catch coastwide only made up a little under 4% of the total catch coastwide. So generally speaking, I didn't hear an overwhelming response.
Is that consistent with past years or any, is that, yeah.
So the 87% of stations were completed. Didn't necessarily, that wasn't due to the ineffective stations necessarily. It was more due to some of the logistical and mechanical troubles that we faced in Area 4 predominantly. In ADAC, Unalaska, and in Regulatory Area 4 CDE, there were some logistical challenges and mechanical issues on those vessels
thanks.
that caused
This
some
is kind of a question for the future, I
a
suppose.
good
maybe,
amount
maybe you
of
can answer.
stations
It's
to
around
be
bait access
left
for
incompleted for this
2022.
season, which led to
there
the decrease in percentage of
Any
stations
issues with
completed.
getting bait access for
Not
next year?
necessarily the ineffective stations. 59 total stations deemed ineffective is not outside of the standard.
All right, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. As far as bait goes,
Commissioner
no, we
Allison, you're
do
next.
not have any concerns with
Yes, thank you
providing
for the
bait for the
presentation,
2022
Kayla. I had a question with
FIS.
regards
We've
to the
already
pricing
obtained
of under
a
32-inch fish.
significant
It
portion
seemed like there
of
was
the
a
2022.
wide variation there, and I was wondering if some of those fish were like the size in that one picture, really small, and maybe that drove the price, or maybe they were way out west where they did not have access to the fresh fish market. Could you give us a little bit of hint of what might have been going on there?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I can try. I know Regulatory Area 2A did see the most significant difference in pricing between U32 and O32 pricing, with the 40% difference, whereas the majority of Alaska as well as 2B did not see anywhere near that significant difference in price. 2B and all throughout Alaska did see anywhere a range of between 4% difference in pricing up to approximately 10%. Recognizing, yes, in Area
thank you very
4A,
much
the fish
that.
do go to a frozen market, so there was, they were higher up in the 10% range.
Commissioner DeGreef.
But overall, 2A did see the most significant price difference in that small in the U32 fish. I honestly can't really speak as to why there's that price difference, and I welcome any others to chime in if they do have more insight on that.
Not seeing any additional questions. I would also like to express my appreciation for this presentation in particular and the efforts that everyone undertook under challenging conditions to conduct the survey this year. Looking at this slide 8 and then thinking about the presentation
Thank you very much,
that's in
Commissioner.
our packet, one and the relative proportion of either ineffective stations or stations that have whale depredation or other factors. And I think that may help us as commissioners just to better understand in the future if we are seeing changes in trends, if we're seeing increased depredation in specific areas. That might be helpful information as we proceed. And just there's a nice heat map, I believe, that is prepared that shows the FIS timing and how that changes between those regulatory areas. So perhaps something like that could be a basis for the future. Certainly nothing for right now, but I think maybe in the future that might be one thing that could help us as commissioners to understand and set in context some of that. Thank you very much for the presentation. I don't see any additional hands. I believe Commissioner Alverson, that might be a latent hand that's still up. And assuming that, I think we're ready to proceed to the next agenda item.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. So agenda items 5.23 will be presented by Dr. Webster. So I'll pass to Dr. Webster. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. This is a very short presentation to be followed by a longer presentation. So I'm presenting results in agenda item 5.2 of the space-time modeling of survey data. Dr. Stewart in his subsequent presentation will be going into more detail on some of these results. But this gives you an overall summary of the output of the space-time model and some related results. So as in the past 5 years, space-time modeling was used to estimate O32, all sizes weight per unit effort, and all sizes numbers per unit effort indices for the time series from 1993 onwards. And we produce estimates for biological regions, IPHC regulatory areas, and coast-wide estimates for the convention waters from San Francisco Bay to the Bering Strait. This is a summary of the output for O32 weight per unit effort by biological region. In the most striking change from 2020 and the change from 2020 to 21 is indicated in the percentage plus or minus in the bottom left-hand corner of each panel, is in Region 3, which experienced an estimated 11% increase from 2020 to 2021. Region 4, on the other hand, had a estimated decrease of 8% over the last year. Coastwide, the increase was estimated to be 4%. For numbers per unit effort, the increases were generally larger and the decreases were smaller, increases in regions 2 and 3, and resulting in a coastwide increase of 17%. Okay. As discussed in the previous presentation, there was a gear comparison study in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A in 2021. And we incorporated the data from the 2 gear types in our space-time modeling, as we've done in previous years. And so we include a parameter to allow for catch rate differences between the 2 gear types. And that allows us to include all the data in the space-time model while accounting for potential differences and also estimating, producing estimates of the differences in catch rates between the 2 gear types. And the results from the 2021 study in Seward in 3A were not consistent with the previous studies in 2019 and 2020 in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 2B. The average weight per unit effort and numbers per unit effort were higher on snap gear, between 118 and 143% of the fixed gear average catch rate, depending on whether we're looking at weight per unit effort, numbers per unit effort. In comparison, in 2019, that ratio was 86%. So in 2020, it was between 72 and 83%. So what that means is in the previous comparison, snap gear was catching at a lower catch rate of Pacific halibut than fixed gear, but the opposite was what we estimated in Seward in 2021. However, this was as already noted, this was a smaller study, in particular compared to the extensive study we did in 2C, which covered the entirety of regulatory area 2C in 2019. And any gear effects were unfortunately confounded with differences in vessel and survey timing differences in the 2021 study. We only had 1 vessel per gear type, so if any vessel differences were also completely confounded with gear type. You can't tell what was if the thing that drove the difference between the 2 gears, between the 2 catch rates. And there was almost no overlap in dates of fishing between the 2 vessels. So the results imply the need for a larger and more carefully designed comparison in this geographic region. Something similar to the design implemented in IPHC regulatory area 2C in 2019, in which we covered the entirety of the regulatory area, but we also had multiple vessels fishing in overlapping time periods. And so we were able to control in that study much more carefully for effects such as differences between vessels and the effects of timing. So we were hoping that this was going to add to a consistent picture for differences between 2 gear types that we had been building up over the last 2 years, but that was not the case. And so more work is required. And there should be a recommendation slide. I'm asking you to note the accompanying paper, which I apologize for omitting from the presentation. So happy to take questions on this short presentation if there are any. That is correct. Thank you for the question, Commissioner de Grief. We, of course, do record the vessels that are fishing each charter region. But
Okay,
we have
thank
many
you.
vessels and fishing different regions and different regions each year. And so our assumption is that vessel differences are just part of the variability in the catch rates. And there's a number of factors that we can't completely control for. And this is one of those factors that is just built into the uncertainty, variability in the
Having
estimates
67% of the
catch
projected
rates for
catch
each regulatory area and
that
coastwide.
IPHC thought they might get. And I've looked kind of peeked forward, and the overall coastwide weight per unit of effort was slightly up and was nowhere near 37% down in 3A. Can you help me reconcile what I'm looking at when I see we only caught 67% of the forecasted fish in 3A, but yet it doesn't seem to correspond to that big a drop in the weight per unit of effort in 3A?
I can do my best, Commissioner Alverson. So there's a couple of things that I can comment on. One is that those are raw based on raw landings, as I understand it, and not based on the data that it's not exactly the same data, whereas I'm using weights from vessel weights per fish and calculating a weight per unit effort or numbers per unit effort. This is a slightly different weight calculation and projection. I'm a little hazy on exactly how the projections are derived, but one important factor that we have to consider whenever looking at raw data is that this does not account for some of the standardizations that we use. And in 2021, there was pretty much an across-the-board positive impact of applying the hook competition standardization. And so we generally had fewer baits back this year in most regulatory areas. And so that led to a positive adjustment. And so the output that you see from the space-time model incorporates not just the raw weights that we obtained on the survey, the numbers that we obtained on the survey, but also adjusts for that competition. And that's something you can explore with our online data, and you can see the effect. It's not just an artifact of the space-time model, which is reflecting what the data say, but you can see that yourself in the adjusted hook and the data adjusted for hook competition on our interactive on our website. So that's a large part of it, but
you had a slide where you talked about some of the sort of
subtleties in the way that
shortcomings or
these are
gaps in the
calculated
survey,
versus the data
comparison.
that I'm using that may affect it as well.
And I think you had been musing about, if you could go back to that slide, I just wanted to see the language there about kind of where to from here. Musing about potentially needing to redo with a larger, I guess, series of stations. Is that a plan or something you're still doing work on? I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, where to from here with these gear comparisons to arrive at a set of results we're more confident in.
It is something that we have thought out, and we have it in our pocket. And if there are the resources to do that, it's something we'd like to be able to do. But at the moment, and Dr. Wilson, Dr. Stewart, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is not a concrete thing that we're certain that we're going to implement in 2022. But I believe the idea is to look at regulatory area 3B for a more expensive comparison similar to what we did in 2019 and 2C.
I believe our break is over, and if folks are ready to...
Yeah, thank you very much. Can we just have the presentation for this agenda item brought up, please? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This one is a little longer. This is a presentation on the 2022 to 2024 FIS design evaluation, in which we'll be discussing how the designs are evaluated and presenting the designs that we've proposed for the next 3 years. So I'll begin with some background on the history of the FIS and the design objectives and review process. Proposed designs, a little brief discussion on cost and presentation of some optimized designs for 2022, which account for one of our goals of long-term revenue neutrality. Okay. So the IPHC FIS, it's our most important source of data on Pacific halibut. It provides data for estimating weight and numbers per unit effort, indices of density and abundance of Pacific halibut, which is used to estimate stock trends, stock distribution, and provides an important input into the IPHC stock assessment. And the FIS also provides biological data for use in the stock assessment. So a standardized FIS has been conducted by the IPHC each year since 1993, standardized for bait and fishing gear. From 1993 to 97, the coverage was limited and generally restricted to IPHC regulatory areas 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B, which comprise the core of the Pacific halibut stock. The modern FIS design on the 10 by 10 nautical mile grid began in 1998, and by 2001, annual coverage occurred in all IPHC regulatory areas, with a depth range of 20 to 275 fathoms in the Gulf of Alaska and Aleutian Islands, and 75 to 275 fathoms along the Bering Sea shelf edge. However, by 2010, data from other sources showed that not all Pacific halibut habitat was covered by the FIS. We found evidence that Pacific halibut were present outside the FIS depth range in both deep and shallow waters, and all IPHC regulatory areas had coverage gaps even within the standard depth range. And such unsampled habitat meant there was the potential for bias in estimates derived from FIS data if the densities were higher or lower in those unsampled habitat than the habitat we were sampling. Therefore, we undertook a series of expansions from 2011 to 2019 to cover the previously unsampled habitat. During those expansions, the FIS occupied for the first time 34% of the stations on the full 10 nautical mile FIS grid that had been previously unsampled. And the result was an improved understanding of Pacific halibut density and distribution, reducing bias, improving our estimates of uncertainty, and not just in the years in which the expansions were undertaken, but throughout the time series. And the resulting expanded grid of 1,890 stations has provided a full FIS design from which stations can be selected for sampling in each annual FIS. And the grid looks like this. The orange dots each represent a FIS station that is has the potential to be selected for sampling in any given year. And so there are 1,890 orange stations, as I mentioned. We also use data from the NIMS Troll Survey in Bering Sea and Alaska Department of Fish and Game Troll Surveys in Norton Sound. And the 2019 versions of those surveys are indicated with the blue and the red circles. So since 2016, we've been using space-time modeling of the survey data to produce estimates of weight per unit effort and numbers per unit effort. And the modeling has two key purposes. It smooths the data in time and space, and makes use of information on spatial and temporal relationships among stations to sort the signal from the noise. The idea is to get at the underlying density of halibut and filter out those effects of random variation that you might see from station to station. It fills in gaps in survey coverage using model predictions while accounting for uncertainty. So gaps were previously filled using ad hoc scaling factors based on ratios of averages and unsurveyed and unsurveyed habitat. And this is a much more consistent and a much more consistent way of dealing with those gaps in coverage for when we, for whatever reason, are not fishing the entire grid each year. So the FIS objectives and design layers, we have primary objective is scientific, and that dictates minimum sampling requirements in terms of station distribution, count, and skates per station. Secondary objective is long-term revenue neutrality, and that comes in through logistics and cost, the operational feasibility and cost revenue neutrality of the FIS. And then we have tertiary objectives, minimizing the impact on the stock, assisting others to collect data, and ad hoc decisions on the FIS design from commissioners. So each year we undertake a review process, which begins by presenting designs based only on primary objectives, which is Table 1 in the accompanying document. Table 1, the previous slide, and also Table 1 in the accompanying document, to the SRB for 3 subsequent years at the June meeting, recognizing that data from the current summer FIS will not be available for analysis prior to the September SRB. So there's a lag in this process. These design proposals, which may be revised if necessary based on the SRB's input, are then reviewed by commissioners at the September work meeting. And at the September meeting, the SRB reviews any revisions to the design proposals made to account for secondary objectives. And the finalization of the design, we present the FIS designs for commissioner endorsement at the interim meeting, which is what we are doing today. And then ad hoc modification to the design for current year due to unforeseen issues arising are possible at the annual meeting. The endorsed design for the current year is then modified if necessary to account for tertiary objectives prior to summer implementation. So that part of the review process would occur over February to April. And we also have stakeholder input into this process. We have consultation with industry and stakeholders throughout the planning process, and input's particularly valuable in finalizing design details as part of the FIS charter bid process. The Secretariat reviews input from the previous year and implements changes where possible. For example, limiting stations or skates in deep waters or other logistically challenging areas were not critical for scientific objectives. And the IPHC's Research Advisory Board provides input into the FIS design implementation at their November meeting, which occurred yesterday. And we had quite an extensive discussion with the Research Advisory Board on the designs and the process at yesterday's meeting, which culminated in the Research Advisory Board agreeing with the proposed design, which you'll see in a moment. So summarizing this review process in a timeline schematic, we have the review process itself along the top, and then the analytical component of the work in devising these designs along the bottom. So we begin by developing the designs over the March to May period following the annual meeting, presenting those designs for Scientific Review Board review at their June meeting. Then, depending on what they say, there may be additional work on refining those designs or accompanying analyses required over the summer. And then the commissioners will review the proposed designs for the subsequent 3 years at their September meeting. And immediately following that, the data for the current year are finalized. But prior to that, all analyses are based on data up to the previous year. And those data are then modeled for producing the space-time model estimates for informing the stock assessment and stock distribution. And then the IM decision is made at the end of November with ad hoc adjustments possibly made in the annual meeting. And layered on that is the stakeholder input throughout the process. including during preparation, input during the FIS itself, particularly from charter vessel operators, post-FIS feedback, the RAB itself, which again occurred yesterday, and during the charter submission period, we also get input. So the proposed FIS designs for 22 to 24. As in 2021, the proposed designs use efficient sub-area sampling and in the IPHC regulatory areas 2A, 4A, and 4B at the edges of the stock, but incorporate a randomized design in the core areas of 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. We continue to propose sampling all the standard FIS stations in IPHC regulatory area 4CDE, which remains a highly dynamic area with apparently northward shifting distribution and uncertainty regarding connectivity with populations near to and within Russian waters. There's a lot going on in that area, and it's important for us, we consider it important for us to continue monitoring that, the distribution of halibut in that area closely. It's likely that these designs represent the maximum effort that can be deployed outside the core areas in coming years while still meeting the secondary objective. This was our proposed scientific design as presented to the SRB in June and as shared with you at the work meeting in September for 2022. So as noted, this incorporates a randomized design in the core areas, sampling just a little over 50% of the stations in areas 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B, while having a more logistically efficient design in areas 2A, 4A, and 4B. Draw your attention to 4B in particular, in which the design includes fishing the western component of 4B, which hasn't been fished since 2019, and hasn't been fished comprehensively since 2017. And our data indicated, or our data showed from the historical time series that this is an area that can undergo change over 3-4 year period of a fairly sizable amount. And so it's important that we sample this at least every 3 years. And otherwise, 4A is the same design as 2021, and 2A is the same design as 2021. 4CD is the same as our proposal for 2021, although we note, as discussed earlier, that only about half of that proposed design was able to be fished due to logistical problems in the current year. For 2023, the most obvious change to our proposal is the addition of stations on the shelf edge in regulatory area 4A, which won't have been sampled, and which were only previously sampled most recently in 2019. But otherwise, it's the same randomized design in the core areas, comprehensive sampling in 4CD, return to sampling the eastern portion of 4B, and sampling the bulk of the core part of the stock in 2A. And 2024 is very similar. So for the areas that are not sampled, that are not included in any of those 3 years designs, which is largely the inside waters of 2B and the low density area parts of 2A, those are proposed to be sampled in subsequent years. With the frequency and the next likely sampling depending on their contribution to the biomass and how frequently they're likely to change. So we imagine that 2A is likely to be sampled within the next couple of years subsequent to this. The 2B component probably will require less frequent sampling. So the idea is that over a relatively short period of time, the entire habitat of Pacific halibut is sampled by the FIS. The Scientific Review Board endorsed our designs. They endorsed the final 2022 design that I just presented and provisionally endorsed the 23 to 24 designs, recognizing that these are subject to modification, conditional on the data that we get in 2022 and other considerations. As part of the evaluation, we strive to maintain precise estimates of the indices that feed into the assessment and to estimates of stock distribution. And the proposed designs continue to have high sampling rates in the core regulatory areas and comprehensive sampling in 4 CDE. And so the coefficient of variation, which is a measure of relative variability, it's the standard deviation divided by the mean. We have a target range of maintaining that less than 15% per regulatory area. And we are well within our targets for the core areas and 4 CDE. And by maintaining the level of sampling that we're proposing, we will stay within that target range. In other regulatory areas, we have to be a little more careful, and this is where the evaluation is most helpful. And based on the evaluation we did in 2021, the beginning of the year, which we presented to the SRB, the proposed designs for 2022 to 2024 will bring the coefficients of variation for all 3 regulatory areas, 2A, 4A, 4B, back to within the target range, which they're currently exceeding largely due to the lack of sampling in 2020. Note that the designs that we're proposing already incorporate some consideration of cost. We've proposed logistically efficient sub-area designs for the lower density IPHC regulatory areas in particular. So the goal here was to provide statistically efficient and logistically feasible designs for consideration by the Commission. We know that the FIS is funded by sales of captured fish and is intended to have long-term revenue neutrality, meaning that any design must also be evaluated in terms of the expected halibut catch, the sale price, vessel costs, bait costs, and secretariat costs. And with that in mind, we bring in the consideration of the secondary objective in particular when reviewing the designs that are proposed for a subsequent year, and particularly for the coming year. And so for 2022, our review process has indicated that in order to achieve the secondary goal of long-term revenue neutrality, we need to make some modifications to the original design. And the modifications that have been proposed is an increase in station density in regulatory areas 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B over and above the map you saw previously for 2022. And a selection of skates per set that optimizes the revenue throughout the range of the FIS. So this is our optimized design, which is our optimized design 1, which is Secretariat's recommendation. It maintains the spatial coverage that you saw in the design that was proposed initially to meet the scientific objectives, and that we have comprehensive spatial coverage in the core areas and targeted coverage in the edges of the stock, but with higher density of stations in the core areas to improve revenue. So this would lead to 1,188 FIS stations being sampled on the 10 by 10 nautical mile grid in 2022. Another design for consideration is optimized design 2, which again has the same basic layout as the previous optimized design, but with a key difference in that we're reducing the number of stations in regulatory area 4 CDE. So the stations that are targeted under this design are those stations that we were not able to fish, in particular in 2021, whereas the stations in the north are the stations that were fished by and large in 2021. So this modifies the design for 4 CDE, and because that's an expensive area, we don't need to add as many stations back in the core areas to meet our objective of long-term revenue neutrality. So this is a smaller design. It has 1,031 stations altogether, but it still meets our scientific objectives and our secondary objectives of revenue neutrality.
Thank you very much, Dr. Webster.
So our recommendations are the commissioners note this paper, note that the accompanying paper presents the FIS design proposals for 2022 to 2024, together with an evaluation of the proposed designs. We recommend that the commission endorse optimized design 1 for the 2022 FIS with full sampling in IPHC regulatory area 4 CDE, figure 5 of the paper, and optimized design 2, reduce sampling in IPHC regulatory area 4CD, figure 6 of the paper, as an alternative if necessary. And the Commission provisionally endorsed the proposed designs for 2023 to 24 as already provisionally endorsed by the Scientific Review Board at SRB 018, recognizing that these designs are expected to be modified in subsequent years. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Stewart. And so it's my understanding, well, I just know in trying to coordinate fishing efforts myself, that obviously it's more difficult to do.
This is Ian Stewart. I've been involved in the
as many strings per day.
We go through a process
skates
where we evaluate the
so
projected
that's
catch
part of
rate,
the calculation
the
as
bait
well,
usage, as well as adjusting the bid
more stations per
projections
day
to
if
account
they
for the
have
number of
fewer, or is
skates
that part of
that
the
are going to be
calculation as
fished.
well?
And so each of these areas will have a target number of skates that depends on all of those factors and attempts to optimize the amount of revenue generated. So essentially, we're only fishing 8 skates where it makes revenue sense to do so. And wherever possible, we're reducing the number of skates as far as possible to as low as 4, not to go below 4 to maintain our scientific minimum.
Yeah, understood. I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. One last question on this diagram, and that is, I thought I was reading, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, either Ray or Dr. Stewart. Does this have any sort of benthic application as well? Are we avoiding, say, stations in certain benthic zones that we would anticipate would have fewer halibut as well?
Yes, we do factor an expectation that the bids will be more expensive when we have to go to 8 skates. And so we are accounting for the fact that the vessel will need to plan for additional time on the water to complete those at 8 skates per day. And that's only, we're only doing that in cases where that makes sense, given the catch rates and the bait expenditure needed to do so.
Okay, thanks for now. That's it for now, Chair. I may come back to a couple other questions I had.
A question about space-time model. I assume it calculates or accounts for depredation and ineffective stations. How does this affect,
Commissioner de Grief.
in
In
annual
adding
basis,
stations
the
back to
level of
the design
uncertainty
in the core
in
areas to help meet our
the
revenue
output,
neutrality target,
like
we
for weight
avoided
per unit effort,
adding
numbers per
stations in
unit
the
effort?
deepest and most shallow waters. So
So if
we
in a
restricted
given
ourselves to the
year,
20 to
this
275
depredation
fathom
and
range, which
ineffective stations
excludes
is
some stations that
high,
are more logistically
does
challenging to
that
fish.
necessarily increase the
and
uncertainty
also
of
generally
these
have lower
projections
density.
for weight per unit effort and numbers per unit effort, or is it the input really insignificant to move that result?
Thank you, Commissioner Yamada. That's a very good question. And it is something that we did kind of do an assessment on this year when we looked at what would happen if we included some of these whale depredated stations back in the analysis while accounting for those, for the effect. And because, as presented, these are generally a very small proportion of the stations are fished ineffectively due to whale depredation. Typically between 1% and 3% of the stations are affected for that reason, and so are deemed ineffective. And because that's such a small proportion of the data, our analysis showed that the impact on uncertainty is negligible. If those data weren't lost and we were able to include them in the analysis, you see a almost an imperceptible improvement in the measures of variance for the indices. And so, it's just a nice feature of the survey that these remain a small number of stations. Now, in some years, in some areas, they can be a little higher, and we've had up to 10% in regulatory area 4A of stations affected. But because we're fishing these stations from one year to the next, the same stations get visited in multiple years, the space-time model is able to account for the relationships, the consistency of catch rates at stations over time. And so we're able to accurately predict in any gaps due to ineffective stations. And so provided we're not consistently missing the same group of stations every year, and we're not, we're able to model precisely through the space-time modeling without any noticeable impact from stations that are unaffected due to whale depredation.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thanks, Ray. If one was to be more conservative and say set a figure of 10%, I assume that would require many more stations and higher costs.
That's a good question. That, well, why not a smaller number? 15 is actually exceedingly good compared to most surveys on a worldwide basis. And the reason we pick that number is because that is a number that allowed us to maintain the quality of the estimates that we'd been getting prior to the rationalization of the survey in almost all regulatory areas. So it was simply a maintenance of data quality. We didn't want to create designs going forwards that produced poorer estimates than those that we've had previously, which inform the stock assessment and which inform the decisions that you make. So it was about maintenance of data quality.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically
right.
it.
Thanks. Could you go to your conclusion slide? Yeah, thank you. So for design 1 and 2, it might help to have a slide added to the presentation.
It depends on your unit that you're interested in. At the regional level, no, we're already maintaining
the criteria,
below 10% CVs in the core areas of the stock.
Yes, looking at those two. I know
And
that you
so
spoke
when you
to
combine
it,
them at a
but,
regional level, the
might
CVs
help
are even
that
lower.
slide that we just,
If you look at
talked about
individual
that,
areas like 2A,
at least for myself.
well, okay, the individual areas of 2A, 4A, and 4B, that would probably require all of the stations to be sampled every year in order to get below 10% in those areas, which is logistically infeasible.
Expenses worked up on either one of these designs?
I appreciate that.
That was my question, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Through the Chair. We do, and we have a simulator that we can provide to you. I'm not sure if it's able to be projected right at this moment, so maybe that's something we can do just after lunch. Thanks, Chair.
Commissioner DeGroof.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, so Dr. Stewart will be presenting agenda item 5.4, the data overview and preliminary stock assessments. Over to Dr. Stewart.
Yes, good morning. I'm happy to present to you today the overview of this year's analysis, the data, the stock assessment, and then looking forward into the mortality projections and decision table for 2022. I'll start with just a brief summary, some of the high points from this year's analysis, and we are seeing some new trends this year. The first, as you've seen from the previous presentations, are that we saw some improving trends from our FIS survey results this year, and these correspond to a shift both in the FIS and in the fishery to younger fish in 2021. These younger fish are the 2012 year class, which are emerging as stronger than the 6 years previous to that. And these fish are going to be increasingly important to the spawning biomass projections as they are going to be maturing over the next few years. However, we are just now getting, in 2021, getting a more solid read on the magnitude of this year class, and we expect that the information in the upcoming years will continue to improve our understanding of just how strong this year class is. Related to the distribution of this year class and the trends that we're seeing, we're also seeing a shift in distribution back toward biological region 3, toward distribution of the stock that is more similar to what we've seen in 10 to 15 years ago than what we've seen over the last several years. And finally, from the stock assessment, the spawning biomass trend is estimated to have been nearly flat over the last year and projected to have very little change due at the application of our interim management procedure. So applying an F43 level of fishing intensity is expected to result in a fairly flat stock trend, which is quite a bit more optimistic than we've seen in recent years, and it corresponds to this increase in productivity associated with this 2012 year class entering the stock. So that's the short summary. Now I'll walk you through each of the components and how we got to those results. The first being the data sources that go into the stock assessment, the assessment itself, the projections and the decision table, and then finally the application of the current interim management procedure and how that breaks down both to individual IPHC regulatory areas as well as to sectors within those areas. We'll begin with a recap of historical mortality from the 1960s onward. And as you'll recall, we hit peak levels in the early 2000s. Those declined until around 2013. And since that time, we've had average mortality from all sources that's bounced around and just a little bit under 40 million pounds. We did note last year during 2020 that many sources of mortality came in below what we had expected and led to a reduction both in mortality and in the level of fishing intensity on the stock. And although the absolute level of mortality has increased to 2021 based on the increase in catch limits, again, we see a relatively lower amount of mortality than we projected. And I'll go into some detail here in a second. I will note, take just a second on this slide to note that you've already seen more detailed statistics on many of these sources of mortality, And in some cases, there are some slight differences between those numbers and the numbers I'll be presenting here. And that reflects updates that have already occurred since we closed the data sets for the stock assessment process. However, any of the updates that will affect the forward projections will be included in early January in an update to the mortality projections. And so we will catch that all up in the beginning of January and have current information for the projections going into the annual meeting. However, those differences are pretty minor. So I'll take you back to last year's annual meeting, noting that we projected the 2021 mortality to be just over 40 million pounds, distributed as you see here. And you'll recall that the non-directed discards, or bycatch in non-halibut fisheries, the method used to project that value is the 3-year average. So it's the average of the most 3 years of recent observations. So those were the projections leading into 2021. Now, at the conclusion of 2021, we see that our estimates have actually come in substantially below those initial projections. So we are just over 2.5 million pounds below where we expected to be at the end of 2021. And there are some important differences here. You'll note that the commercial landings came in below, in aggregate, below where we projected. And the commercial discards came in above. And we did have some discussion of this in the earlier agenda item. And I'd like to point out the method for projecting commercial discards. And that is to calculate the rate from the previous year and to apply that rate to the projected landings in the upcoming year. And so anytime that we see a case where the commercial discards have increased relative to the projection, it suggests that the fishery is actually discarding more fish and that the rate has gone up from the previous year. In the case of 2021, this is actually good news because this reflects the increased encounter rate with these smaller fish. The fishery began to encounter this 2012 year class in greater abundance than they had the previous year. And so this is also consistent with what we've seen in our survey results for this year. So I'll go into a little bit more detail, but the other two components that changed fairly dramatically are the recreational component, which was up nearly 1 million pounds from what was projected, and the non-directed discards, which the 2021 estimate at just over 3.5 million pounds was well below the projection. And even if we then apply the 3-year average, which will be used for the forward projections, we see almost 1 million pounds of decrease in that projected non-directed discards. And so as you'll see when we move into the mortality projections at the end of this presentation, there will be some additional yield available for the same overall mortality as a function of this decrease in non-directed discards. To provide you a little bit more detail on these two sources specifically, we already had some discussion about some of the factors that reduced the recreational fishery in 2020, and also some of the factors that caused that substantial rebound in the 3 areas with the largest recreational fisheries, those being 2B, 2C, and 3A, all saw a large jump from 2020 to 2021. And that was a combination of less restrictive domestic regulations and a combination of, I think, more travel and more participation in these fisheries than was anticipated early in the season when those regulations were put into place. So we now see that in aggregate, recreational mortality is essentially as high as it's been in about a decade. Looking in a little bit more detail at the non-directed discard mortality, as I noted, 3.5 million pounds is the lowest in the recent time series, and in fact the lowest since we've been accumulating this information beginning in the early 1960s. In fact, the decrease from 2019 has been 46%. And so for another year, we see very low levels of non-directed discard mortality. Although there were decreases in several IPHC regulatory areas, the largest proportional decrease over this time period has been in the Gulf of Alaska, an IPHC regulatory area 3A. And this, noting that I'm not an expert in all of these fisheries, there have been some fairly major changes in many of the non-halibut fisheries in the Gulf over the last several years as a function of market changes, closures due to encounters with other species, and other factors. Okay, moving now into the survey results. You've already seen from Dr. Webster a brief summary of these survey results, and rather than recap the specific results that he already brought up, what I want to do is to provide a little bit of context of how these results are going to relate to the stock assessment, and perhaps which are most important for us to focus on in thinking about the results from this year's assessment and mortality projections. So I'll highlight two areas here. The first is Region 3, and that's where we saw the largest increase in numbers. So this first slide shows you the change in numbers, and the trend in numbers is what goes into the stock assessment. This is their primary index of abundance in the annual stock assessment. A 28% increase in Region 3 provides a very strong signal coast-wide and is the largest contributor to that 17% increase we see at the coast-wide level. And this is because the majority of the stock occurs in biological Region 3. The other point, the other place that I would highlight is Region 4. And you'll recall last year at this time, we were relying on a survey in 2020, which was truncated due to the challenges faced during COVID. And so we didn't have any sampling in Region 4 and actually reduced sampling in Region 2 and in parts of Region 3 in 2020. And as a function of that, we did not have clear information on what was going on with the trends in those areas. In Region 4 now, on the basis of the 2021 survey, we can now see a very strong decrease in the numbers of fish in biological Region 4, which was not evident in last year's results. I will note, following the discussion from Dr. Webster earlier, that the 2021 survey is the first survey for us to fully benefit from the rationalization that we did over 2014 to 2019. So this was the first survey. We would have had that case in 2020 had we not had to truncate that survey design in 2020. So the 2021 survey has resulted in essentially the most effective survey we have put on the water. We have the largest information content, and you can see that in this figure by the width of the shaded bars, which are the credible intervals. This is the most informative survey we've had, and we did it. It was not the largest footprint, not the largest number of stations, and that's because we were able to make this survey more efficient now that it's been rationalized and we're drawing from the full design of the survey. So I do want to highlight that we have updated our understanding of the trends, and particularly in Region 4, on the basis of this year's survey where we were lacking information last year. Moving then from survey numbers into all sizes weight per unit effort, you'll note a couple things. One is that the trends are slightly less pronounced in all sizes weight per unit effort. And what that indicates is that the current stock is getting somewhat less productivity from growth of fish that are already in the stock than from the numbers of fish or recruitment that are moving into the stock. And this is the opposite of what we've seen over the last several years as the survey and the fishery have been accessing fish that were growing older. We saw actually just the opposite pattern. We saw stronger patterns in weight per unit effort than we did in numbers. And that's now reversed for this year, reflecting this change from older fish to younger fish moving into the stock. And I want to go right into a figure of age information from our fish survey. This figure shows you on the x-axis the age of fish, on the y-axis the year, and the circles represent the proportion of number in terms of numbers of the catch in that year at that age. The blue circles indicate males and the red circles indicate females. And I'll highlight a few particularly important year classes here. On the left, the long diagonal there is the 1987 year class. The next one towards the right-hand side of the figure is the 2005 year class, which has been the most numerous in both the survey and the fishery over the last several years. And then at the right-hand edge there, you'll see the 2012 year class. And in 2021, the 2012 year class was the most numerous age class in the fish catch for the first time. So we've jumped now from what had been older fish dominating the catch down to younger fish dominating the catch. And this is going to be important both for our trends in the near term as well, in particular, in our trend in spawning biomass over the next several years. So the next result that we get from the modeled FIS results is our best estimate of stock distribution, or the percent of the overall coastwide biomass that occurs in each of the biological regions. This year, on the basis of the 2021 survey, we started to see an increase in 2020, but it's become much more pronounced in 2021, an increase in biological region 3 particularly, leading us to a proportion of the stock in region 3 that is larger than anything we've seen in almost a decade. Much more consistent with the 60 to 65% of the overall stock that we were seeing in biological region 3 in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so this is an indicator of how this 2012 year class is currently distributed. And as you saw already in the results, this year class, it currently does appear to be distributed in the Central Gulf, and particularly in the Western Central Gulf. Now, I'm noting that each of these panels is on a different scale, so you can see the trend a little bit better. The scale is much lower for region 4B. On average, there's only around 5% of the stock in region 4B, and that's actually held relatively constant over the last 15 years. Looking then at regions 2 and regions 4, these are showing the opposite trend from biological region 3, with a relatively sharp decrease in the proportion of biomass distributed to these two biological regions over the last couple of years. I'll move now into the last result that we get from our FIS survey, and that is the O32, or legal size weight per unit effort. And you saw a panel of this already by biological region from Dr. Webster, but I also want to use this as the basis for a comparison between our FIS results and the observations coming from fishery logbooks on an annual basis. Both of these are important components to the assessment and management procedure process. The first, the fishery weight per unit effort, is fit directly in the stock assessment as an index of abundance. And the FIS O32 WPUE provides the basis for the current management procedure in terms of the distribution of the TCEY. So these are key components, and I'll step through one regulatory area at a time and provide some comparison between these two, beginning with the coastwide trend. So similar to the survey figures you've already seen, the percentage on each panel reflects the percent change from 2020 to 2021. Each panel is going to show you our modeled FIS results on the left and the logbook information from the commercial fishery on the right. And there is one caveat on the commercial fishery, which is that at the time I close the data sets for the stock assessment each year, we don't yet have all of the logbooks. The fishery is still ongoing, and in fact, we won't have all of those logbooks in hand probably until sometime next spring or summer. What we've found over the last 10 years is that when we get the remainder of those logbooks, we do tend to see a decrease in the catch rates that we estimate for the commercial fishery. And based on advice from our scientific review board, we've developed a correction which accounts for the average change that we see at the end of each year. And so when we apply that correction, our best estimate of trend for 2020 to 2021 is no change, is that we'll have a relatively flat trend across 20 to 21 in the commercial logs when they are complete. Now I'd like to just step back here and just taking this figure at face value, you see very close correspondence between our FIS results and our fishery reported trends from the logbooks. We had relatively high catch rates in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a long period of decline through about 2010 to 12, depending on the series, with a few ups and downs, more stability since that time. And we certainly, there are lots of reasons why the commercial fishery can be different than the survey on an annual basis, but when we step back and we look at decadal scale trends, we are seeing a very similar trend at the coastwide level between these two sources of information. If we go now on an individual IPHC regulatory area level, beginning at the southern end of the stock with IPHC regulatory area 2A, here I've divided the commercial catch rates up into the two key component fisheries, commercial fisheries. First is the tribal in blue, and the second is the non-tribal in green. These fisheries are quite different. They operate at different times. The tribal fishery is generally in the early spring, and operates in the northern part of 2A in the waters off Washington. The non-tribal fishery generally occurs in the early to mid-summer and in waters much farther south. Of course, the IPHC FIS survey covers the entire region of 2A, and although we didn't sample every station in 2A in 2021, we sampled enough to generate a relatively precise trend there compared to recent years. Now, this is probably one of the areas where we see the biggest difference between our FIS survey and what's going on in the fisheries. And I think this is because these fisheries are very much not comprehensive across the whole area. And so what we're comparing here is the experience of these fisheries in relatively small times and places compared to the broad estimate, including the Salish Sea and the waters from northern Washington all the way down to central California. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these panels as I go through, but what I'd like you to evaluate is just the general correspondence between the trends. For areas north of 2A, I'm providing the two different primary gear types used in the commercial fishery, fixed gear and snap gear. And this is IPHC regulatory area 2B. I would note here that we've seen a decrease in catch rates over the last 4 years from all of these sources that then showed a reversal in 2021, and we saw increases across all 3 series in 2021. Moving up to IPHC regulatory area 2C, the fixed gear on the commercial side and the survey are very similar, showing declines over the last 5 years, and also some decline in the snap gear, although not quite as pronounced over that same time period. But generally showing a dip in catch rates in the mid-2000s, some recovery thereafter, and then this very clear decline over the last several years. Moving then up to IPHC regulatory area 3A, we see a downturn in 2021, where we've had a relatively flat trend with some ups and downs across all of these series leading up to that. That same general trend appears to be carrying through until 2021. The big news, of course, in this year's survey was the very strong increase in IPHC regulatory area 3B. You'll note that the shaded intervals on the left-hand panel for the FIS survey are very small, and that corresponds to the very high level of precision that we achieved in IPHC regulatory area 3B, based on sampling more than 60, I think about 63% of the stations in our overall design in that area in 2021. So we got a very precise estimate of that level of increase at 57% from 20 to 21. We've seen an increasing pattern in both of the fishery gear types in the last several years. Not such a strong increase just from 20 to 2021, but actually some increases beginning all the way back 3 years ago. However, I will note that for all of these series, we are still not far above the lowest catch rates in the series and well below the higher catch rates that were observed in the late 1990s. Moving out to 4A, this is another area where we do see a highlight here. We do see a difference in the 2020 to 21 trends, where the fishery did see some increase in 2021, and we did not catch that increase in the 4A FIS survey in 2021. Again, here, all of these series are quite close to their lowest levels in the time series. Moving out to 4B, we've seen a very flat trend in 4B from the FIS survey, and perhaps more pessimistically, we've seen ongoing declines in the commercial fishery catch rates in 4B for quite some time now. There was the exception being that we did see a small increase in snap catch rates from 20 to 21, but in general, both of those fishery catch series are quite close to the lowest levels of commercial catch rate that we've seen in the time series, and similarly for the survey catch rates. Finally, when we move up to the Bering Sea, to IPHC area 4C, D, and E, we can see on the left that very strong trend of decreasing catch rates that's been occurring over the last 6 to 7 years in our FIS survey. On the right-hand side, the fishery here is divided, again, geographically, as I did in 2A, with 4C and 4D separated. Now, 4C-D&E is another area where we have some pretty big differences. That, as you saw from Dr. Webster's presentation, our FIS survey includes not only the Bering Sea edge, the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew Island, but also an estimate of abundance or biomass in this case for the entire eastern and northern Bering Sea flats. And that is based on trawl survey information. And so this biomass estimate from the FIS survey represents the aggregate across a very large geographical area, where the commercial fishery in 4C, of course, is around the Pribilof Islands, a relatively small geographic area. And in 4D, although the edge is fished to some degree, much of this catch in recent years has been coming from the area around St. Matthew Island. So in aggregate, both of these fisheries combined have a much, much smaller footprint than corresponds to the estimate from our FIS survey. I want to move now into some more fishery statistics. So this shows you the average weight of a fish that was landed by the commercial fishery across each of these regulatory areas. And here I've combined all of the areas in Region 4 so that I can extend this graph a little bit farther back. What you'll note here is that, of course, the fish were larger in the late 1990s on average, just over 30 pounds, declining to just over 20 pounds somewhere around 2010, and have been relatively stable at the coastwide level. That black line down the middle denotes the coastwide average. We've seen some stability at just over 20-pound average coastwide. If we look then at our IPHC survey from the same information from the FIS, and this is limiting only to legal size fish that were captured on the FIS, so this is then directly comparable to the commercial fishery, you see in aggregate a very similar pattern. A little bit more variability perhaps because the sample size is smaller, but a similar pattern. I do want to go back and highlight one thing. You'll notice that series at the top of IPHC Regulatory Area 2C has a very large drop at the end of the time series from what was the largest average size fish in 2020 to that still the largest in 2021, but quite a bit smaller and much closer to the estimate from IPHC Regulatory Area 2B. So I was curious to see whether this corresponded to what we saw in our FIS survey. And although we did see a small decrease in the average size fish in 2C in the FIS survey, it was not as pronounced as it was in the commercial sampling. So I don't have an explanation for that, but I don't, because it's not represented in both of these series, I think it would make sense to see what another year's data looks like before we try to draw any conclusions about that particular drop. Moving now into the fishery ages. So this is the same kind of figure that I showed you for the FIS, with age on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. Males and females again in red and blue, noting that we only have 4 years currently of sex-specific age information from the commercial fishery. Or actually, I shouldn't say we only have 4 years. We now have 4 years, which is the most we've ever had over the last 100 years. And as this is now part of our standard monitoring and sampling program, we collect these fin clips through our port sampling. They get analyzed. They do lag 1 year. So I don't have sex-specific information for 2021. But as this time series grows, it continues to become more and more valuable and provide us with a very good way to track the dynamics of the commercial fishery that we didn't have until just the last few years. So here again, I want to highlight, and sorry, that arrow is fairly small. I'm going to bring up an arrow to highlight the most numerous age class in the commercial fishery in 2021, noting that it is not the 2012 year class. However, the 2012 year class was the second most numerous age class. And so what this is telling us, we saw in the FIS that the 2012 was the most numerous age class. Well, this is fishery landings, and so it's not reflecting the encounters of smaller, younger fish that occurred on the water. So this is actually quite good correspondence with what we saw in the survey age data. And what this tells us is that over the next several years, we should be expecting to see a similar pattern. As this 2012 year class increasingly grows above that 32-inch minimum size limit, it's clear that the fishery is already starting to straddle these 2 year classes and actually shift toward this younger 2012 year class. So there's one more component in the average size of fish. It's not just the age of the fish, but also the weighted age of those fish that contributes overall to the productivity of the stock. And so this figure shows you the historical female weighted age for 5 different ages, which span the most important ages that contribute to the commercial fishery. So age 8 through age 16. And this reconstructs these trends all the way back into the 1930s. So we're all familiar with the fact that in the late 1970s, Pacific halibut were much larger for their age than they have been in recent decades. The good news in this figure is that starting in the last few years, we started to see an increase, particularly in the younger age classes. And each year, that increase in weighted age appears to be moving its way up through. And so, in fact, in 2021, the average size of a 12-year-old halibut has almost caught up to the 14 and 16-year-old halibut that are in the stock above them. And I've mentioned this potential trend for several years now, but I think this is the first year where it's actually becoming clear that it's occurring across most regulatory areas, and the signal's really starting to come through at the coast-wide level. If you're interested in more detail, I would encourage you to go to our website and investigate our FIS data visualization tools. You can actually look at the raw data on weighted age on an area-by-area basis and see for yourself what these patterns look like across each of the IPHC regulatory areas. And I will also note that as of 2 years ago, all of the weights that we're using, both here and for the commercial fishery, are directly observed weights. So we're not relying on a length-weight relationship to create this information. These are actual measured weights, both at sea on our FIS survey and on the scales as associated with our port samples. So I've highlighted the importance of this 2012 year class moving into the stock, and I want to put them in some biological context. So this is the estimate of the maturity schedule for Pacific halibut, showing you here that we currently understand that roughly half of the Pacific halibut are mature by the age of 11.6 years. And they're maturing somewhere between 8 and maybe as old as 18 or 20 years old by the time they're virtually all mature. And I'm showing this year in particular to put this 2012 year class in context. So the 2012 year class in 2021 is 9 years old, which means that we estimate that approximately 19% of that year class, of those fish, are currently mature. Over the next 3 years, they're going to be on the steepest part of this curve, moving up to an estimate of 56% of those fish mature by 2024. And so when we get to the projections from this year's stock assessment, what you're going to see is that those projections show a more optimistic trend in the spawning biomass, and that trend is primarily a function of the maturity of this 2012 cohort. So I will put one note of caution here in that the more optimistic results that you see this year are conditioned on the expectation that this year class will be maturing over the next several years. And to the degree that it may be ahead or behind of the average maturity curve, it is certainly a note of caution as we rely increasingly on these fish, both to contribute to the spawning biomass, but also over the next several years to contribute heavily to the directed commercial fishery. Okay, to round out the data section, I want to speak just briefly to the ecosystem conditions. You may recall that we use the Pacific Decadal Oscillation as a broad measure of productivity in the Gulf of Alaska. And what we've found over the historical time series is that when the PDO is positive, here on this graph shown as the green points above the center line, when the PDO is positive, we generally see on average higher recruitment. It doesn't predict individual years very well, but it does predict on average decadal scale trends in recruitment. And conversely, when the PDO is negative, we tend to see lower average recruitment. And I note here that we have just come from a period of higher PDO values from 2014 through 2019, and that 2020 and 2021 are both back into negative PDO values. Of course, it will be quite a few years until we have a good read on the actual strength of those year classes. But on average, over the historical time period, we have seen a relatively strong correlation between recruitment and the Pacific decadal oscillation phase, either positive or negative. Now, I've got quite a few things on this slide. This slide is meant mainly to provide you with a source of reference material if you're interested in more detail about the ecosystem conditions across all of the major regions that are relevant to the Pacific halibut stock. Each of those links at the bottom of this slide will provide you with the most recent ecosystem report for each of the regions noted there. And rather than read these off, I can actually sum it up quite easily, which is not much to report for 2021. We've seen some mixed trends in different patterns in different places, but compared to the last few years where we had the warm blob of water in the Gulf of Alaska in 2014 to 16, we've had some anomalous ice years in the Bering Sea over the last several years. Really not much to report in 2021. We've returned to somewhat more normal conditions across all of the major regions affecting the Pacific halibut stock. Now, I want to provide one additional slide, which is new this year, which is a brief consideration of which of our IPHC data sources and assessment methods are robust to potential changes to the stock due to climate change. And this is something that we've been highly aware of in the Secretariat and have spent a considerable effort trying to structure our 5-year research plan around making sure that we are able to measure and respond appropriately to potential changes in the stock. And you'll hear more about this from Dr. Planis and can see it in our other documentation. But I want to provide you a few just brief highlights of some components of our data and assessment methods that I think are robust to climate change and a few that may not be yet. So the first section, climate change responsive, as we discussed earlier in this meeting, our current FIS design and the way we analyze that using the space-time model is highly responsive to potential shifts in distribution. What we want to know here is if something changes in the stock, one, will we detect it? And two, will we have to do something different to respond? And in the case of our FIS design, the answer is if the stock starts moving, yes, we will detect it, because we're now sampling across all the IPHC regulatory areas. And two, we won't have to change our method. So our annual design process that was just presented by Dr. Webster actually accounts for shifts in distribution. And if we start to see that we need more effort in some areas than others because of shifting stock dynamics, our current method will accommodate that. Similarly, with regard to biology, weighted age, we measure fish both on our FIS survey as well as in our ports. And so this extensive annual monitoring means that if we start to see changes in the biology of the stock in weighted age, as we are actually seeing in the last few years, although I'm not sure that those increases are related to climate, they could be, we will be able to detect that rapidly. And again, we won't have to change our monitoring. We're already collecting these extensive samples. Within the stock assessment, when we estimate recruitment strengths, these are informed by the age data that's being collected both on the FIS and from the commercial fishery, now in the last few years including sex-specific information from the commercial fishery. And again, if we start to see shifts in recruitment, of course we have a lag in our ability to detect those for several years as these fish grow and move into the fisheries and into our data sources. But we will detect those changes as they occur. Finally, as of the 2019 stock assessment and consistent with our MSE process, we're using dynamic reference points which explicitly account for the current biology of the stock, the maturity, the weighted age, and other things that are affecting productivity, as well as the recruitments that have led the stock to get to the state that it's in now. And so again here, if we start to see longer-term shifts in productivity, this is already accounted for in the way that we're dealing with reference points, both in our annual stock assessment and in our strategic management strategy evaluation. Now, there are a few places where we need to do some additional work to become more capable of responding to potential climate change. And you'll see these highlighted both in our presentation of our current research as well as in our 5-year research plan. The first of these is that we are currently using a static maturity and fecundity estimate. And what we need to do is get to the point where we have monitoring of these over space and time. So right now, if these were changing, we would not have an easy way to detect that. But that, again, that is a strong component in our forward-looking research plan. The next thing that we don't have is a good understanding of the factors affecting these various biological parameters. So, for example, with weighted age, if it starts to change, we are definitely going to detect that change, but we don't necessarily know why it's changing. And that leads to very low predictability. So that's why one of the reasons why we don't try to project 5, 10, 15 years in the future is because we don't understand the factors that are influencing these. And so that, again, this is another strong component of our forward-looking research, is to try to better understand the factors that are affecting these biological components. And then finally is the fishery dynamics themselves. So we know that the potential for climate change is going to have a feedback through the fishery itself, how the fishery operates, how and when and where. And this is another component that I think we need to be considering as we look forward to the future, how that's going to affect both fishery operations, markets for those fisheries, and other things. So to recap what I've just told you in terms of data highlights, 2012 is becoming increasingly important. It was the most numerous cohort in the 2021 FIS, and the fishery is currently in transition to these younger fish. They were a close second in terms of the most numerous year class in the fishery. We'll be relying on these fish to mature over the next few years, and their distribution appears to be strongly affecting the distribution overall in the stock, which is now showing some shifts back toward biological region 3 on the current distribution of these younger fish. So I'll move now into the modeling results from this year's stock assessment. And just to remind you where we are in the stock assessment process, the 2021 stock assessment corresponds to an update of last year's assessment, which itself was an update of the full assessment that we conducted in 2019. So we are on approximately a 3-year schedule. And this being the second update, we anticipate a full stock assessment coming up for 2022. What does that mean when we do an update? Well, it means that we're not making any major structural changes to the models or the methods, or in most cases, the data sources. We have, of course, every year some incremental changes as we work with our scientific review board, some refinements to specific data sources, and those are presented and reviewed by our SRB in our 2-meeting series in June and September. And then, of course, every year we update the data from the previous year where anything was incomplete, and we add whatever is currently available for the year that we're in this case, 2021. The stock assessment continues to rely on 4 individual stock assessment models. These represent 4 different ways to look at the data, and each one responds somewhat differently when we add new information. In some years, the survey information may cause one model to go up and another model to go down slightly, or vice versa. By using 4 models, though, we dampen some of that interannual variability and provide more stability to the results because all 4 models together tend to provide a much more stable response to new information than any one would on its own. And this, again, this is not a change. We've been using this same 4 model ensemble since the 2015 stock assessment. So these are the results then from each of the 4 individual models. You can see that they differ somewhat in scale as well as in trend, but in aggregate they're telling us a similar thing, which is that the biomass peaked somewhere in the late 1990s, declined sharply through somewhere around 2010, and then increased somewhat until 2016. Since 2016, all of these models have been estimating a decrease in biomass, and at the very end of the time series, we estimate either a relatively flat or slightly increasing or decreasing trend, but all relatively similar in the overall trajectory for the last decade, being relatively stable. When we put all of these 4 models together into this year's results, shown here as the blue shaded bands, this is the result of the aggregate ensemble, and on top of that is shown each of the results of the last 9 stock assessments. So each has a black line indicating the spawning biomass estimate from that stock assessment, And the red dot at the end of the line indicates the terminal biomass estimate from that year's stock assessment. So what you're seeing here is 10 years of stock assessment, with the most recent year as the dark blue line down the middle that you can see at the very end of the time series. And what you can take away from this is that all of these models have been providing a relatively similar picture of the stock trend since about 2010. You will note that 3 of these models at the very beginning of this figure in the early 1990s are indicating a somewhat higher biomass than we estimated in earlier stock assessments. And that corresponds to the shift in 2019 to utilizing the commercial sex ratio at age information that was previously unavailable. And that did increase our estimate of the overall spawning biomass particularly during that early time period. But the bottom line, this year's stock assessment is very consistent with the results from the last 9 stock assessments. If we look then at the individual recruitment time series from each of these models make different assumptions about the level of natural mortality, about the relative selectivity of different components in the fisheries, and other biological factors. So on an absolute scale, each of the models can differ quite substantially in the number of incoming recruits. This is actually age 0 recruits, so we don't see these fish for a number of years afterwards, after the time in which they're born. Now, if I put each of these on a relative scale, it makes it much easier to see where these models do and don't agree about the relative strengths of different year classes. So dividing each one by its mean, you can see that all 4 of these models are providing us with a quite similar picture of which of these cohorts has been the most important over the last several decades. Working from left to right, I'll highlight the 1999 year class, which has been quite important, but is largely gone from the spawning biomass at this point. Next is the 2005 year class, which is still present in the fishery catches and in the spawning biomass, but is decreasing rapidly as they age. Those fish are now 16 years old in the 2021 data. Of critical importance to our current dynamics are the 6 years highlighted here, 2006 through 2011, which all 4 of these models estimate to have been much lower recruitment levels than virtually anything we'd seen in the decade leading up. So it's not uncommon to get a low year of recruitment, but to get 6 in a row has led to the declines in spawning biomass that we've estimated over the last several years. And it's led to the case where we are now, where the fishery and the survey both are essentially stretching across this gap from the earlier 2005 and earlier year classes, reaching out to this 2012 year class, which is now estimated to be stronger than all of those most recent 6 and more on a level with the 1999 and 2005 year classes. Certainly nowhere near the magnitude of 87, which is not produced on this particular figure, but definitely better than the last 6 years. Now, at the end of the time series, you'll note that all of these models are providing a somewhat different perspective on those most recent recruitments, and that's because we have very little information to tell us the relative magnitude of those year classes. So looking forward, we're going to need several more years of data to give us strong information about the relative strength of year classes, and particularly those from 2014 through 2016, when we saw warmer waters in the Gulf of Alaska. And we're very interested to see how that may or may not have affected Pacific halibut recruitment. But we do have several more years to wait. Now I want to look just at a single model's estimate of recruitment. And I want to illustrate for you how important the data has been over the last several years. So this is the time series of recruitment estimates from just one of the 4 stock assessment models. And each of the lines, the blue line is this year's estimate of recent recruitments. And then going back through the red, the black, and the green show you the estimates from that same model, just sequentially removing 1 year of data. And what that shows you is if we go back just 3 years in the time series, we have essentially no information about the 2012 year class being any stronger than the more recent, than the year classes preceding it. And so this really illustrates the window in which we need to wait for information. So the 2012 year class, of course, was 9 years old in this year's data. So we go back just 3 years old to when that year class was 6, and we know very little about its relative strength. So moving forward, I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind, is that these fish have been in the water for at least 6 years, and really more like 9 years before we start to get a good read on the relative strength of that particular cohort. Looking now at our estimates of fishing intensity that come from the stock assessment, this is a time series based on this year's stock assessment. Fishing intensity measured relative to our current reference level of F43%, with the x-axis higher on the x-axis reflecting a higher level of fishing intensity. So the taller the bar, the harder we're fishing the stock. The purple line at the end of the time series shows you the reference level that was in place in each of these recent years. So from 2016 through 2020, we had a reference level of F46%. And in 2021, the Commission adopted a slightly higher level of fishing intensity as the reference of F43. But you'll note here that despite moving to a higher level of fishing intensity as the reference, and actually an increase in the TCEY for 2021, as I showed you in the first couple slides of this presentation, because of the lower absolute mortality, many sectors not achieving their full catch, we again have a second year of lower fishing intensity than we've estimated. And so now what we see is, at the end of the time series, 2 years in a row where we have lower fishing intensity than we've seen essentially since the late 1990s. So this is caused the challenges faced by the fishery in the last couple of years have actually resulted in a bit of a break to the stock in terms of fishing intensity over 2020 and 2021. At the end of 2021, based on our best estimates, the level of fishing intensity is estimated to be at F46%. So where we ended up in 2021 is actually pretty close to the reference level that we've been using for the last several years. Moving now into an estimate of relative spawning biomass. So this is a measure of the spawning biomass we have now compared to the spawning biomass that we would have expected to have in the absence of any fishing. So I'll highlight a couple things. The first is the dashed line, which corresponds to our SB 30% trigger. If we assess the stock to be below that in any particular year, that suggests a reduction to our reference level of fishing intensity. And then secondarily, our SB 20% limit reference point, which essentially this is the conservation zone in red at the bottom of this figure. If we estimate the stock to dip into that conservation zone, we would recommend reducing the targeted fishing to 0 in order to rebuild the stock to higher levels. So at the beginning of 2022, we currently estimate the stock to be at B33%, or slightly above the trigger reference point of SB 30%, and almost exactly at the same level that we estimated at the beginning of 2021. So relatively flat in terms of relative spawning biomass. Now this table is also reproduced in the summary document. It provides a number of different metrics with which to gauge the current properties and current and recent properties of the fishery. The various rows correspond to metrics based on mortality, based on the level of fishing intensity, based on the level of spawning biomass, both absolute and relative, and referencing the biological stock distribution. I'm not going to go through each of these, but they're there for your perusal. I will highlight at the bottom a new set of indicators, which is an index of the biosocioeconomic conditions that are experienced by the fishery. And we do estimate that the fishery is currently 23% above the 10-year average. So let me give you a little bit more detail about what that calculation entails. So the biosocioeconomic index is a measure of the relative conditions experienced by the fleet. It is inflation adjusted, so the effect of price and cost is consistent across time. It does reflect the price of Pacific halibut, the ex-vessel price, as well as two of the primary costs that go into the commercial fishery, both fuel and wages. And it also reflects the biomass that's available to the fishery in any given year, based on an index from the FIS 032 weight per unit effort, or those fish that would be most available for utilization by the commercial fishery. This index is calculated both by region and at the coastwide level. And to aggregate it to the coastwide level, we weight it by the fishery CEY, which is a reflection of the overall amount of opportunity that's available to the directed fisheries. I will note that this is not an absolute measure of profit, as it can be considered more on a per quota or on a per opportunity basis. So what does this index look like? This is the index going back to 2000. The black line down the center is the annual coastwide index. The dashed lines represent the regional indices, noting that, like the biological components to the stock, in this case, Alaskan waters, where the bulk of the stock occurs, will have the largest effect on the overall coastwide annual index. And then also shown on this figure for comparison is the coastwide FCEY, to give you an idea of the total amount of fishery yield that this index is likely to, or corresponded to, in any particular year. Okay, I'll move on now and provide just a quick recap of the modeling and then to the projections. So this year's stock assessment, there were basically no surprises, quite consistent with what we saw coming from last year. The exception being that the strength of the 2012 year class was increased, and it's still being updated by new data. This is perhaps the one major uncertainty that we have this year is, as we are only a few years into our measurement of this 2012 year class, I think as we gain more information, we'll get a stronger and stronger read on just how strong this year class is compared to 2005 and 1999 before that. The challenges faced by the fishery in the last couple of years have resulted in lower levels of fishing intensity. And as a function of both of those things, the incoming year class and the lower level of fishing intensity, we've seen that the projection of spawning biomass decline has slowed, and we've actually saw a flat trajectory over the last year. Okay, I'll move now into the last shorter components of this presentation. First, the projections and decision table, and then finally the detailed management procedure results. To refresh your memory from last year, the projections and decision table are based on a constant TCEY applied over the next 3 years. I provide a range of different fishing mortalities, from no fishing mortality at all up to a large value, this year 60 million pounds, with some additional detail across the range of most interest to management quantities from fishing intensities of F40 through F46. And then, as I've done in the past, I'll also provide a few specific reference points for comparison. The first is the 3-year surplus, which is the break-even point, or the level of yield that would produce no more than a 50% chance of the spawning biomass dropping below where it is now in 3 years' time. We also provide the status quo, which is rolling over last year's coastwide TCEY to see where that falls, and then the reference level, which is the 2022 TCEY based on the current F43 reference level of fishing intensity. So graphically, you can see here under no fishing mortality, the projection is for an increasing stock getting back somewhere near where we were in 2016 by the end of the 3-year time series. The 3-year surplus production is, of course, by definition, a flat projection, ending where we began at the beginning of the 3-year projection. I will note here that the 3-year surplus is estimated to be 38.0 million pounds of TCEY this year, which is substantially larger than we've estimated in the last several stock assessments. So to put this in context, the next figure actually shows you the estimates from each of the recent stock assessments of that same calculation. And we weren't operating in TCEY through this entire time series. So the bars here show you both the TCEY in blue as well as the total mortality, which is a pretty closely corresponds to the TCEY in each of these years. The red dots show you the actual yield that was taken in each of these years. And what you can see is when you go back into the time period of 2015 to 2016, the estimates of surplus production were pretty close to the amount of yield that we were actually taking. And that was the time period over which the spawning biomass was increasing slightly. Then, as you move forward into 2016 through 2020, you see that our estimates of surplus production decreased. This was these low recruitments moving into the spawning biomass. And during each of those years' stock assessments, we were projecting a very high probability of stock decline at the levels of yield that we were taking. Now, as of the beginning of 2022, this projection is for an increase in surplus yield. And as I mentioned earlier, this increased surplus is primarily coming from the 2012 cohort as it matures into both the spawning biomass and the commercial fishery catch. The next projection is the reference level of 41.2 million pounds, which is slightly higher than the reference level was estimated to be last year. And what you'll notice here is that for the first time in several stock assessments, the reference level corresponds to a decreasing trend, but not a very strongly decreasing trend. And this is because this 41.2 is actually quite close to the level of surplus production that's available from the stock over this time period. Finally, at 60 million pounds, you can now clearly see the contrast in the effect of fishing on the stock. At 60 million pounds, we would not only be using up all of the available surplus production, but actually tapping into the standing stock of spawning biomass over the next 3 years. And that's why you see a relatively strong decline in biomass projected at that level of TCEY. Okay, so these same projections then form the basis for the decision table. And the decision table provides a risk-benefit trade-off between potential yield in the future and the probability of stock or fishery trend or status decreases. Basically, what's the probability that something bad happens given a given level of yield? So to orient you to the decision table, we provide yield options across the top of the table, ranging from no fishing mortality on the left-hand side of the table, bracketed by a lower and higher values to be able to see some contrast in the probabilities. And then across the middle of the table is that key management range of F46 to F40%. Diving then right into the table, the first section of the table is with regard to stock trend. So the way you read this is, what is the probability or what's the chance that the stock is going to decrease over the next 1 to 3 years? We note that the 3-year surplus, highlighted here in blue, has exactly a 50% chance that the stock is less at the end of the 3-year time period than it is at the beginning. That is, by definition, what that column corresponds to. The status quo and reference level TCEYs at 39 and 41.2 million pounds all correspond to just over a 50% chance of decline in the first year of the time series, with those probabilities of decline decreasing slightly as time goes on. And this is, you're seeing the effect of that 2012 year class moving into the projections over the second and third year of the projections. So at current levels of yield or at the reference level, we estimate just over 50% chance that the stock will continue on a downward trend in spawning biomass. The next section of the table is with regard to stock status. So this section poses the question, what's the chance that we will dip below our SB30 and our SB20% reference points? And you'll note here that across the entire range from F46 to F40, there's just under a 50% chance of dipping below that SB30% trigger. So this shows you, one, how flat the stock trajectory is, and two, that based on a comparison to where the stock would be if we weren't fishing it, the stock is in a relatively stable state just above that 30% reference level. And looking to the third year in the projection, those probabilities of dropping below SB 30% again decrease slightly as we see this new spawning biomass moving into the standing stock. Finally, the last sections of the decision table are the fishery trend and fishery status. So what we're asking here is, what's the chance that if we take one of these TCEYs, the fishery would have to take an additional decrease at some point in the next 3 years to stay on that same track? The reference level, and then the bottom part of the panel here shows you the fishery status, or what's the probability that we would exceed our reference level. That is, of course, 50% for the reference level column. That is by definition. the column that provides a 50% chance of exceeding F43%. And you'll note that across all of this range from F46 to F40%, these probabilities don't differ very much. We are essentially at a coin toss as to whether the fishery will be able to move through the next 3 years without taking an additional cut from these levels of mortality. Okay, the last section of this presentation now provides you with some additional detail from the coastwide level moving down to the level of individual areas and sectors within those areas. I'll note here that information paper 2 provided in the background materials for this meeting will provide you with a much more thorough description of the current interim management procedure. This procedure, components of this procedure have been in place for a long time, but all of the components together have been in place over the last 2 years. The baseline of this calculation is our reference level of fishing intensity, the 30-20 control rule, the use of O32 stock distribution, and the application of slightly higher harvest rates on the east side of the stock than on the west side of the stock. The adjustments that occur after that baseline are 3. The first is in 2A, the TCEY is set to 1.65 million pounds. The second is that the percent of the coastwide TCEY that is assigned to IPHC regulatory area 2B is a weighted average of 0.7 times 20% and 0.3 times the percentage that comes from the baseline calculation. And then finally, the last adjustment is an accounting for the effect of U26 non-directed discard mortality that occurs in Alaska. And so the way this calculation works is I do a model run where I take all of the U26 non-directed discard mortality out of the projection for Alaska. I calculate what the TCEYs would be for all regulatory areas in the absence of that mortality. And then I take the difference and I add half of that difference back to IPHC regulatory area 2B. And I'll show you what the specific value that corresponds to that for this year. So I've gone into quite a bit of detail there. I also want to note that none of this has changed from last year. This baseline and these adjustments are identical to the calculations that were made for the 2021 mortality projections. So how does this look in practice? Beginning with the O32 stock distribution as estimated from our space-time model, applying the relative harvest rates, then produces a target TCEY distribution shown here as the third row of this table. Now, I will note, that, and this is an important point, is that this is using the 2021 observed stock distribution, and we're now projecting forward a target TCEY distribution for 2022. So implicitly, we are assuming that the way in which we saw the stock distributed in 2021 is going to be applicable to the 2022 fishery. Or put another way, we're expecting the fish to stay in the same place we saw them last year when the fishery operates in 2022. So that's certainly a consideration of how accurate we think that might be. Ideally, we would have some in-season information to help us guide this, but the reality is what we have is last year's stock distribution is the most current estimate of how the stock is distributed. So we can then apply, from that baseline, we can then apply the adjustments. The first is to 2A. The second is the weighted formula for 2B, which results in 18% of the coastwide TCEY of that, as that weighted average. Then, given the reference level of F43% and the total TCEY, we can calculate the distribution across all of the IPHC regulatory areas and also include the accounting step for the effect of U26 non-directed discards in Alaska. That accounting step amounted to approximately 140,000 pounds of additional TCEY in 2B in this projection. And that is slightly smaller than last year as a function of the decrease in estimated non-directed discards that occurred over the last several years. So that's the distribution to individual IPHC regulatory areas. To put this into context, first at the regional level, this provides you with the reference calculations for the last 3 years and then 2022, as well as the TCEYs that have been adopted for each of those regions. Noting, of course, that the reference level of fishing intensity did change. So in 2019 and 2020, that was an F46 reference, and then from 2021 forward, that's an F43 reference. So all other things being equal, we would expect larger TCEYs from the reference calculation under an F43 than we did under the previous calculations. And in fact, we see that effect from 2020 to 2021 of an increase there. Some of that increase corresponding to the change in the reference. We can then provide the same information broken down all the way to the level of individual IPHC regulatory areas. And you can see that primarily as a function of the change in distribution that was estimated for 2021, there are some relatively large changes here. Perhaps the largest proportional change would be IPHC regulatory area 3B, going from a reference calculation of just over 3 million pounds last year to almost 6 million pounds looking forward to 2022. And again, that is reflective of that very large change in stock distribution that was observed as part of the 2021 FIS. This last slide then takes that reference projection and breaks that down into the individual components and sectors for each IPHC regulatory area based on the catch agreements or catch sharing plans that are in place in each of those areas. So I won't go into detail here, but I do, on my next slide, I do want to highlight that this information will be updated one more time before the annual meeting. This update will occur in early January. We wait till early January so that we can have the end of year 2021 non-directed discard mortality estimates, which will be finalized the first week in January. Those will then, I will then update the averages calculated and the projections used for these mortality tables. And that will lead to an updated mortality projection tool, which will be posted somewhere around that same time. Those will then be available for a few weeks leading up to the annual meeting for everybody's use. I'll also note that on request of the Commission several years ago, we've moved to this format of having a summary document included in both the interim meeting and the annual meeting. However, and we will of course update that summary document for the annual meeting as needed. But I do want to highlight that the full stock assessment document and the data overview, which provides considerably more detail than we can put in the summary, is posted each year directly to the stock assessment webpage on the IPHC website, which is linked from this slide here. And that will be updated on the same schedule and also available ahead of the annual meeting for your consideration. And so with that, the recommendation is that the Commission note this presentation, which provides a summary of everything I've just spoken to. Thank you.